Good afternoon to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for Monday, the 17th of August, 2015. A lot to talk about, so I'm going to jump right into it. First, the sea surface temperature anomalies for today, the departures from normal or average, whichever way you want to look at it. A couple of things should immediately stick out. First of all, the Pacific, the North Pacific as a whole here, quite a bit warmer and dominant over the Atlantic Basin as a whole. We also see the El Nino here in the tropical Pacific. Trade winds have been lighter than normal through this region, and so the water is allowed to warm up abnormally so, and you get this El Nino signature not only at the surface but also at the subsurface. But I think as remarkable, and maybe even more so, is all of this anomalously warm water above where it should be over the rest of the North Pacific, surrounding the Hawaiian island chain, and here butting up right against the west coast of North America. Very warm Pacific Ocean as a whole, and that in and of itself is a huge piece of the current weather pattern situation, creating all kinds of interesting weather, including the typhoons that we've seen in the Pacific, a rather busy Central Pacific hurricane season with a couple of threats already to Hawaii. Luckily, no direct hits or any major consequences. Now let's look at the Atlantic Basin, and you notice that pretty much from about 40 degrees latitude down to around 10 degrees of latitude here, the water temperatures are running above where they should be. Clearly, you can see that between Africa and Central America. Only a couple of very small areas of blue showing up here, and I'm going to show you something very interesting. This is what it looks like today. Again, August the 17th, all right? This is what it looked like 2 months ago. I mean, there is absolutely no comparison. That is amazing. And I think that quite a few people were forecasting or thinking, or whatever the case may be, that this temperature pattern in the Atlantic would hold through the hurricane season, but instead, look what happened. In fact, from Africa all the way out to about 42 degrees of longitude in the main development region here, a good half of it or more is running above normal. We're starting to see a half a degree to a degree Celsius here. You know, this corresponds to that. And unless this data is inaccurate, which it shouldn't be, one would hope, right? This is eye-opening. This is very interesting. And you can see, of course, the subtropics very warm, Gulf of Mexico running above where it should be, as is the Caribbean Sea. But I think what's happening is the warmth in the Pacific, especially in this El Nino area, is dominating the pattern, creating an upward motion that's kind of stuck over here overall, and then that air rises and then sinks in the Atlantic Basin, creating the westerly winds that we're seeing screaming across the Caribbean. And you also have this warm water up here kind of displaced from the deep tropics. And so this air is rising, and then it sinks down here and creates this sort of dry pattern. That's my theory. It's hard to know exactly because, remember, everything's transient. You get different outbreaks of Saharan air embedded across this dry pattern that we've seen for the last few years, a very dry air in the mid-levels of the tropics here. So there's a lot of different things interconnected, but I'm going to tell you, I think this big signal here of all this red, this above normal water, is sort of overwhelming the pattern and not allowing much to get going in the Atlantic, despite this warming that we have seen, probably more so than the experts were predicting for this period coming up as we start to get towards the peak of the hurricane season. Looking at actual sea surface temperatures, now this is remarkable. This is the scale down here. Look at these two colors here, this sort of weird green color, whatever you call that, like a green apple color, and then this yellowish color. That's 30, 31, 32 degrees Celsius water temperatures, upper 80s to almost 90, covering 90% of the Gulf of Mexico. We're talking about 87, 88, 89 degrees at the surface, but there's also very substantial heat content in the Gulf, meaning that that warm water is also extending fairly deep. So we really, I'm telling you, you don't want a hurricane in the Gulf this year where you have an ideal upper level pattern, because the water is untapped, there's plenty of heat content, and this is ripe for something very powerful to get going if the upper level winds will support it and the vertical instability issues are not in the way. Water temperatures here are exceptional, and that's the same off the east coast of the United States. The water temperatures out here, these are actual temperatures, but these two are running above normal, low to mid 80s right along the coast. And I said this before several weeks ago, a couple months ago now probably. Here's Cape Cod, where we had frozen, sort of slushy ocean waves coming in as late as March. And then now, just a couple hundred miles south, if that, the water is 80 to 81 degrees. Pretty remarkable how nature flips things around, isn't it? So let's move along and talk about climatology, and that'll help me to segue into what's happening currently in the tropics. So here we are, real close to the midpoint here of August, and the ramping up normally of the hurricane season would begin. And you see here that we still have all the rest of this to go between now and the end of November in a normal distribution type season. Well, this is not a normal season. We have the El Nino, we have some weird things going on in the Atlantic, the much warmer than normal North Pacific. But in a typical average season, this would be your distribution, with the peak of all storms, hurricanes, everything being around September the 10th. And as you can see, we have quite a climb, climatologically speaking, to get there. So how does that go with what's happening now? Well, so here we are, August 17th. We're starting that climb towards the peak. And yes, we do have something out here. Invest area, 96L. Why do they call it that? What exactly is a 96L? Well, instead of just saying this blob of clouds out here, or that tropical disturbance, or whatever, the Hurricane Center has a naming convention using numbers, 90 through 99, and in this case the letter L, or sometimes AL for Atlantic, to help designate an area that's worthy of further investigation. From satellite data to running computer models on it, you kind of zero in on it and it becomes an area of interest, or an invest as they call it, an area of investigation. And we're up to the sixth one, or I guess this is the seventh because you start with 90. So we've already had a 90L, a 91L, so forth, and we're up to 96L. And when we get to 99L, which we will, we'll start over again. And it's just a way to keep up with what's what, especially if you have a disturbance here, and maybe, if you had another one here, this would be 96L, this would be 97L, so forth and so on. Hopefully that makes sense. So here's 96, jumping ahead. 96L way out in the deep tropics, and they give it 50% chance of developing into a depression over the next 2 days, and then a 70% chance over the next 5 days. Now I'm going to go against the grain here and argue for why this won't develop. Obviously I have an interest in hurricanes, and I think they are fascinating to study at landfall. I don't root for death and destruction, but if one comes our way, we go out and we study them up close and personal. So if you hear me arguing against development, I think you know that the odds are probably against it. And here's why. You can't argue with what you have in front of you. Some people like to make a mountain out of a molehill. And, when you have a hurricane season like '05, where pretty much everything was a mountain of its own, Katrina, Rita, Wilma, etc., you don't need to hype it up any more than it already is. And the evidence shows, I think, that 96L, located right here, probably won't develop. And here's why. This large outbreak of Saharan air is vastly more superior in aerial coverage and its smothering capability, I believe, than this tropical wave and associated surface low has to survive that. I think this is overwhelming, is another way to put it. I think this will win out, and our tropical wave down here, even though it's at a low latitude, will ingest this dry air in as it kind of curls around, and it'll slowly fizzle out, and that'll be that. It'll just go away, and it'll end up being sort of this weak surface low drifting along, maybe bringing some rain, much needed rain to the islands, and that should be just about it. You can see the dust itself on the visible satellite shot here. Look at that. There it is right there. Very clear, and this tropical wave is struggling. It doesn't have a very good S shape to it. The top part of it is kind of choked off from the moisture because there's all this dry, probably warmer air at the mid-levels and it's stable. It's like a cap. The storm chasers on the Great Plains know all about when warm air comes in and caps the atmosphere. You don't get convection, and that's what's happening out here. Convection is the engine that drives these tropical cyclones, and right now all this dry, dusty air not allowing that convection to take shape. Funny, though, that the models, some of them, are very ambitious and take this up to Category 3 in the next few days. I don't know if the models get to take a peek at what's going on out there in reality sometimes. I know that sometimes these, you have statistical models that are fairly simple, but even the HWRF, the Hurricane Weather Forecast Intensity model here, suggesting it'll be a Category 1, I don't see it. I think that the AVN here, the GFS intensity, has it right, that it never even makes it close to tropical storm strength, really. And that's about it, because I do believe that this dry air regime is going to win out for now, and this isn't going to develop. In the Pacific, we do have Tropical Depression 11E, and here's the forecast track. That is the southwest part of California, San Diego down here, and this is the Baja. This is well away. No worries whatsoever from that system. However, moving around the globe, this is where all the activity is. Very warm water out through this region here associated with the El Nino. Not quite this far west, believe it or not, but sufficiently warm enough nonetheless. We have another powerful typhoon here, Typhoon Goni. And if we click on it, you can see the forecast track taking it towards Taiwan. Yuck, they don't need that, but it could be heading in their direction over the next several days. And then we have Typhoon Atsani, and it is probably going to turn more to the northwest with time and track pretty close to Japan, possibly, on a path similar to this, if I can draw. Maybe over the next several days, something like that, we'll see. But the Pacific is where all the activity is for now. I do think the Atlantic will produce 2 or 3 hurricanes before all is said and done, because of that warm water that we have out there being warmer than I think people previously had thought. That eventually the base state of the atmosphere will allow maybe 1 or 2 extra hurricanes to develop than was previously forecast, I believe, and that's probably going to be in September. So if we're going to have a big hurricane season impact-wise, I believe it'll be in September, and I think that makes logical sense. It would, just looking at that. September's the peak anyway, and I think this year it'll be even more so, and they'll have a quick cutoff probably sometime in October. But you never know. Maybe the pattern's changing, and the Atlantic's going to begin warming. There are indications that it's going to be very warm next year, but that's next year, so don't even worry about that. But there you go, my arguments for why I don't think 96L will develop. We'll watch those twin typhoons in the Pacific. In the meantime, have a great rest of your Monday. Thanks as always for tuning in. I'm Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. Talk to you again tomorrow.